So yeah, let's dive in. I have all sorts of stuff, and I'm very excited to talk sparrows. So again, my name is Adam. I've been here with Georgia Audubon for about 7.5 years now. And prior to coming here, I was doing work with sparrows. And so this was one of the first webinars that I wanted to put together because I love them. I think they're amazing little birds. And I think for some folks, they can be quite intimidating. And so I'm going to maybe help you find them a little less intimidating, or at least tell you why they're so amazing, and hopefully some small tips or identification characteristics that you can focus on next time you're out looking at a meadow or a grassy area or the edge of a forest. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. Again, though, we'll be recording for this. Feel free to ask questions. We're trying something new tonight with the recording, so we're probably going to wait till the end of the presentation to answer those questions, but please fire them off whenever they come to mind. And yeah, if there's any Zoom issues, Melissa or someone just yell at me and I will do my best to fix it. So let's talk sparrows. Of course, there we go. So why do I love sparrows? Why should you love sparrows? Why are we here? They're amazing for many reasons. They have incredible behaviors, incredible life histories. This is a tease for what's going to come in about an hour when we're talking about white-throated sparrows, which is what you're seeing here. These birds have a lot going on, even though it might not look like it from this relatively drab-ish, subtly beautiful little bird. But many sparrows have complex life histories, complex behaviors, complex social systems, and we're going to talk more about that later. But that's why one reason you may enjoy sparrows. I always feel like I don't know what I'm going to expect when I go look for sparrows. You know, oftentimes it's in early spring like this or late fall, and you can find a mixed flock of species. And it's just, there's often something uncommon or rare mixed in, or at least you feel like that possibility is there. So maybe you have to look through 200 chipping sparrows before the one clay-colored sparrow like this pops out. But that mixed flock behavior, especially in the winter months and in migration, is pretty interesting and often exciting. They're difficult, and for some of you, that might be why you don't like sparrows. You obviously like them somewhat if you're willing to give them a shot and listen to me talk about them. But I enjoy that. You know, they are challenging. They're not just going to come sit on your feeder all day, at least most of them. They can be a bit of work. They're a bit of a puzzle, but I think they're a worthy puzzle. And so a Henslow sparrow here is not always the easiest bird to find, and sometimes they're up on a piece of rush or grass like this, and they're blown in the wind. And to me, that's a fun challenge, but I can see why it can be difficult for others. And despite them kind of being lumped as brown birds, they can be striking. They can be beautiful. Their browns can be subtly beautiful, which I'll show you later. But they're pretty birds. They're down low. They normally give you a good look when you can get a clear shot of them. So they're just amazing for so many reasons, and we're going to touch on a few of those today. So I'm going to go real broad here, and then we'll kind of narrow down over a couple slides. But what is a sparrow? What are we talking about? They're passerines, which is the super broad category for perching birds, for songbirds. So, this does not include ducks and geese and loons and things like that, but it's pretty much all the vireos, warblers, sparrows, tanagers, things like that. They tend to be on the smaller side. They're not kinglet small, or obviously not hummingbirds, but they tend to be small. However, some can be quite chunky, especially down in Latin America. They're primarily seed eaters, especially those that are further north in the Americas than the US and Canada. But they do take a diversity of foods, and especially during the breeding season, most of our seed-eating birds will eat a good bit of insects, especially when they're feeding their young, because it has that extra protein to help them grow faster. As you know, many of them are brown or shades of brown, shades of gray. Again, I'm going to try to convince you to love that variation in that color scheme. But most sparrows are kind of in that general category, at least the ones around Georgia. Helpfully, many of them have a really heavily strung pattern head, like this chipping sparrow, obvious cap, bright white eyebrow, black eye line, a little Fu Manchu or a Maller marking. So where they may lack in color for some species, they make up for it often in pattern. So those are kind of super broad sparrows. And in general, when I'm talking about sparrows, I mean New World sparrows, sparrows of the Americas. And the sparrows of the Americas are part of this family. If you go back, remember science and your taxonomy. I won't go too nerdy here. They're in the Passerellidae family, and there's around 130 to 140 species, depending on what taxonomy you look at, in this family. So 130 some species. It's not entirely known whether they started in South America and have evolved and kind of moved in, colonized North America, or the opposite is true. You know, where the first sparrow came from, we don't know for sure. In the genus Zonotrichia, there are 5 species, which we'll talk about later. One of them is the rufous collared sparrow, which you're seeing here, a very common bird in Latin America. It's the only Zonotrichia in Central and South America, but it's actually the oldest of the species. So it's thought that the ancestors of the Zonotrichia genus started in Latin America, and they moved north and then split off into the white-throated sparrow, the white-crowned sparrow, the golden-crowned sparrow, and the Harrison sparrow. So some interesting ambiguity about their evolutionary history and how their biogeography. Frustratingly or confusingly, they are not closely related to the Old World sparrows. The Old World sparrow you know best is the house sparrow. So even though sparrows there, they're not closely related. I think this is probably I don't know, the 5th, 6th time I've given this presentation, and I feel like I've updated this slide every time because their taxonomy, their relatedness to other species is always a bit in flux. They are most closely related, or as of now thought to be related to the Old World buntings, and even the chat tanagers, which are a unique small grouping of species in the Caribbean, on the Dominican Republic, and on a few other Caribbean islands. So really interesting placement in relation to other species and other genuses. It's thought that maybe the blackbirds and the warblers are their closest relatives. It used to be the finches that they thought they were more closely related to. So it's interesting. It's still a bit messy, which part of my OCD mind, it bugs me. And at the same time, I find it exciting. But New World sparrows is what we're going to be talking about today. And within that family, the Passerellidae, of those 130 some species, they go from the Arctic to the southern tip of South America and everything in between. So they're wide ranging in their habitats, at least on a broad family overview. Each species is pretty narrow in their niche and what habitat they prefer. But we have, again, Arctic breeders, desert sparrows, tropical rainforest sparrows. The tropical ones tend to be larger, which is kind of interesting because sometimes there's some general rules that when individuals get further north or south to the poles, they tend to get larger in body size. But these sparrows, the tropical birds are the bigger ones. The northern birds are kind of what you think of as a sparrow, brown, streaky. The southern species or the tropical ones tend to lose that streakiness. They have larger, more bold, or illustrate the differences, big, small, brown, green. You know, I guess the field sparrow isn't that streaky, but it's a diverse group. That has a lot going on for it. But as much as you all might get excited about seeing sparrows from Costa Rica and Brazil, we're going to talk about the northern sparrows, mainly the birds of Georgia, or at least the US and Canada. These sparrows tend to like more open spaces, open country, structurally more simple habitats. There are some of these birds that are in dense forest, but in general, they tend to be on the edge of forest, or where there's lower early successional growth. So kind of when an area is transforming from a grassland to a forest, kind of that scrubby appearance. That's where many of them like to hang out. They are open cup nesters. So, you know, they build a little cup of nest that you think of when you think of a bird nest, not like a bluebird or a nuthatch that goes in a cavity. They're going to build their nest each time. Very few of them are domed. Their young are altricial. Altricial just means they're kind of the naked young that need to be cared for by adults. Precocial is like a baby goose. When they hatch, they can start walking. So sparrow babies need all the help they can get. And they prefer to be lower to the ground. There aren't too many sparrows that are going to be 30 feet up in a tree. They'll go up there occasionally, but many of them are down low. Many of them nest low. This is a nest I found years ago of a grasshopper sparrow down on the ground. So one thing that they do have going for them and for us as bird watchers is they're low. They make it a little bit easier for us. No such thing as sparrow neck compared to that warbler neck you might get sometimes. So physically, what are some of their adaptations? Again, what kind of makes a sparrow, at least the ones that we're talking about? They have conical or conical shaped bills. Those are really helpful for, again, crunching those seeds, because most of them are going to be primarily seed eating birds. They can be kind of chunky. I think I've used the word chunky a few times, or thick, but they're not super elongated and skinny like some of our warblers or things like that. Most of these birds have rounded wings. And the more you learn about bird behavior and bird anatomy, typically birds that do long distance migration have more pointed wings or angular wings. So a rounded, somewhat shorter wing indicates that sparrows do migrate, but not as far as many of our other birds. We've talked a good bit about their color already: streaked, tans and browns. Many of them look the same. They have one type, monomorphic, so the males and females look the same. It is not true for all of them. The eastern towhee on the bottom there, you might be familiar with the female having like a milk chocolate brown, where that bird is showing black. That's the difference between a male and female. But the upper bird, a swamp sparrow, you can't sex them unless you're holding them in the hand during the breeding season. They look identical. Many of these birds have adapted to use their legs for leaf tossing, again, finding those seeds that have fallen on the ground, finding the grubs that they might need to feed to their young. And oftentimes they're good in dense habitat. So they're very agile. They can kind of snake their way through, briars and other thick areas. And again, they cover a range of habitats, but there are some that are more sparrowy places, and places where you can find these specialized species. Prairies and grasslands is definitely a spot for sparrows. There are some that are very localized to that type of behavior. There aren't big trees out in those spaces typically, so they behave a little bit differently. So in this type of generic setting, you might find a Henslow sparrow or a grasshopper sparrow or a Vesper sparrow. They're often perched up on a blade of grass or a rush, like the one I showed earlier, that Henslow sparrow that was perched up. I took that photo in Indiana in a big reclaimed strip mine area. Many of these birds, because they don't have those elevated perches, they're very mousy. And by that, I mean they run, they hide. Sometimes they're incredibly difficult to find because they don't flush. They'll just run around your foot and can be very tricky. So oftentimes these open grassland birds, especially the open grassland sparrows, are hard to find and some of the most desired of the sparrow species from us bird watchers. I think the widest swath of sparrows are kind of in this edge, scrubby, successional type habitat. This is a picture of a bog in upstate New York that has, again, some lower vegetation mixed in with some trees. It's not too dense. It's not a full forest. It's not an open grassland. This is a great spot for song sparrows, which honestly aren't too picky. Lincolns, white-throated field sparrows. Again, lots of good leaves and other detritus for them to kind of kick around and find food. With the mix of medium-sized perches here, this is a good spot for these birds to perch up on a snag or a broken off branch and sing, scan their territory, drop back down. So I'm kind of doing a lot more up and down than the birds we saw in the grasslands. And then kind of a different type of grassland or a similar type habitat would be that of marshes, something that we have a lot of here in Georgia, especially down on our coast. We have some very specialized birds of fresh and especially saltwater marshes. So seaside sparrow, salt marsh sparrow, LeConte sparrows are all kind of marshy birds in general. Seaside sparrows, which breed along our coast, they have super large feet, can help them walk on the wet mud that you have during low tide. They have a long beak. They can probe like a shorebird, but they can reach other things like that. And these birds can be difficult too, because it's hard to get into that prime habitat. It's hard to walk around. It's expansive, but there are some specialized kind of marshy sparrows as well. And of course, everything in between, forest birds like fox sparrows, which we'll talk about, but in general, kind of grassy, marshy, simple type landscapes. And then that edge and early successional type habitat is where you're going to find most of the sparrows here in Georgia and throughout the United States, especially the eastern US. So what kind of range maps do we see for our sparrows? Some of them are pretty general and widespread, which I'll tell you what I mean. And some are a bit more specific, keying in on those habitats that we just talked about. So there are some that are nationwide. Our song sparrow is pretty much everywhere. And I think I'll show a range map here in a little bit, but it would fill in the entire thing. There are song sparrows most spots, except for South Georgia in the breeding season. They're kind of a rare bird when it comes to the nesting season, but they're common in the winter. There are many sparrows in the US that have an eastern distribution, which is what you're seeing on the left there with the field sparrow. A lot of our eastern birds, not just sparrows, but warblers and vireos and things, have a similar distribution. You have the moisture coming off the Pacific. It rains in the Rockies there. Then you have that rain shadow. You have the desert, and you have then getting into the prairies. And so a lot of these birds start to pop up when we get into that prairie grassland habitat, and can persist into the deciduous forest that we have here in the east. And you can see some birds, like that field sparrow, are harder to find down in Florida and the coastal Gulf regions, because you're getting that different habitat type. But in general, grassy forest edges, field sparrows can be anywhere there in the eastern US, and that's what many of our sparrows do. There are some like LeConte's, which are much more central. They're much more grassland or freshwater marsh dependent. So they go up into central Canada, where there are the prairie potholes regions, or beaver ponds where they can nest on the edges of those. Some are coastal, whether it's Atlantic or Pacific. And then, of course, there are some that are really specific and really unique, like the Bachman sparrow. They key in only on longleaf pine forests, typically those that are burned somewhat frequently. So that's a bird here in Georgia that we'll talk more about. But you kind of have these general ranges: nationwide, eastern, of course, western, but we're not talking too much about those tonight. Central, especially those that come in overwinter down in Georgia, and then Atlantic coastal species. So a lot going on, but there are some generalities that might help you. So I hinted at this a bit earlier when we were talking about how sparrows have rounder wings. Most of our sparrows, all of them to some extent, or almost all of them to some extent, are migratory. But very few of them are doing these big journeys. Only a handful make it down to Mexico, and the grasshopper sparrow is one of the few birds that will go even a bit further into Central America. Compare that to many of our warblers. Most of those birds are going to Central America or Northern South America, or even further south. Our shore birds are going all the way down to Argentina, some of them Brazil. So they're a short to medium distance migrant. Sometimes you'll have a place like where we are in Georgia, where there might be we might have a species year round, but it might not be the same individuals, because you might have some birds that migrate down from their breeding grounds, and then a northern population replaces them. Thinking of white-throated sparrows, some of those birds breed in southern New York and Pennsylvania. Those birds might migrate down to Virginia or something, and then birds from Canada might replace them. And also what's interesting is sometimes you get what's called a leapfrog effect, where actually the birds that nest the furthest north will go the furthest south in migration. And the birds that nest kind of far north will or kind of south, excuse me, not to confuse us, will just go a little bit and then go back up. So interesting migration. And in general, males tend to overwinter further north than females. This isn't just a sparrow thing. This happens for a lot of birds, especially those that do a shorter distance migration. And the theory is the males want to get back to the breeding grounds as soon as possible when the seasons change, so that they can get on territory and start doing their songs and displays to try to attract a mate. So again, white-throated sparrow is a bird I know a good bit about, and I know they're one of these birds that they really push it. They want to stay as far north as they can, many of them in the winter, so that they can get back up as soon as the conditions are right. So here are a couple interactive eBird range maps, just to show you where some of our sparrows occur across the country. This is a map of the Savannah sparrow. So on the bottom, that bar is going throughout the calendar. So we're about to hit September. The hotter kind of white orange is where there's a higher number of those birds reported. So here's winter. You can see we have Savannah sparrows throughout Georgia, especially in South Georgia. Then in spring migration, they spread up north. They avoid some of the desert areas out west. Then Savannah sparrows aren't in our state at all. And then here comes September and October, and then they return back down to our state. Here's another one. This is the grasshopper sparrows. Remember, I said they go down to Mexico and Central America. That's why we're not seeing any grasshopper sparrows. Then we get a rush of them in spring migration, it's coming sooner than we think, which is exciting. And then back again in fall, they leave the US. There are a few that will hang around in Florida, maybe South Georgia, but in general, these birds vacate the US, come back big time in April and May, and you can get out to an agricultural field, or if you're lucky, a healthy grassland nearby, and maybe find some nesting grasshopper sparrows. But you can see there aren't many that nest here in Georgia. And then this is the white-throated sparrow, super common winter bird here. which is why it's so hot white there. And then they almost exclusively breed in the boreal forest, which is almost all in Canada, in Alaska. So hard to find in the lower 48 during the breeding season. Then they rush back down in the winter. So again, you can also see all these birds, or especially the grasshopper sparrow and this white throat, have more of that eastern distribution. These birds do fan out west a little bit as they go north. But yeah, this is where you can find white-throated sparrows throughout the year. This is a bit more of a detailed look at the field sparrow. So you can see here that we in Georgia, especially the northern 3/4 of the state, we have field sparrows year round, but we get an influx of them in the winter. So here's the winter months. We have lots of field sparrows. There's the breeding season. The northern birds leave us. Our breeders stay behind. Fall migration, it's going to get darker purple again because we're getting those northern field sparrows back down south. So we're far enough south that we have that for a lot of birds, where like bluebirds, you might have a lot of bluebirds at your feeder during the winter months. It's because we're getting some of those northern birds added to our birds that don't need to migrate or don't need to go as far. So similar with field sparrows. And if you're curious about some of these resources on eBird, I know some of you might be eBird users, you can also see some cool things with their data and science here, where it shows you the general habitat types that you might find these sparrows and how that could change throughout the year. It doesn't change much here for field sparrows. But you can see that they like kind of a closed or a woody savanna type habitat or a mixed forest. They're not going to be found in deep oceans or barren landscapes. But it's kind of neat. Croplands is kind of that peachy salmon color in the middle. So it shows you where you can find these birds and how that might vary depending on the season and depending on where they overwinter or breed or things like that. So there's, you know, they're not flying to Peru and back, but they have some very unique seasonal variation in their behavior and in their distribution. So thinking about the behavior of a sparrow. So we're kind of talking about where they go, where they hang out, how their physical characteristics might affect where they eat and what they do, and also their behavior. And I'll kind of get to the point on why we're touching on all this natural history. In general, sparrows are territorial. So I just mentioned the males want to get back to the breeding ground for some of those species because they have a little patch of forest edge, a little patch of grass that is theirs, and they try very hard to defend it. That's why they're singing for defense. They're singing to attract a mate to, show her, hey, this is my patch of forest, and it's good, and it has lots of resources, whatever it may be. But during the winter months, once the breeding season is over, hormones calm down, they're not territorial. Most of them relax in the winter, especially those that migrate. And you can find these large flocks, sometimes mixed flocks, that will have multiple species. I kind of mentioned earlier how I think that's a very exciting time in the winter months to find a flock of sparrows, because you can have one species or you could have 7, all kind of loosely associating, which is great. And they do this to find food, safety in numbers. Again, they're kind of the smaller birds. So if a Cooper's hawk is going to come by, your odds are better if there are 25 sparrows rather than you and one other little field sparrow. Most of these birds are monogamous, which again, they have their territories. So they're defending their spot. They're trying to attract a partner. They're raising a nest there. However, the more genetics that can be done is illuminating more and more on birds' behavior. And in general, what I would call sparrows they're socially monogamous. They have a partner, they have a territory, but depending on the species, they might try to seek what we call an extra pair copulation, see if they can get some paternity in a nearby nest with a neighboring female, for example. So mainly monogamous, and we could do a whole webinar on different breeding strategies for birds, but there is some funny business going on occasion, depending on the species. One thing that I think is really helpful for identifying species, and we'll talk about this, and especially with our bird here, which is a Vesper sparrow, is how they flush. So I already talked about how they move. Some birds are mousy, and we'll talk more about that, but how they flush can be helpful in identifying a bird too, because do they do a short flight? Do they appear to be strong flyers? Do they go up? Do they go down? If you flush a flock, is one different than the other? Can you kind of train your eye to pick out the oddball? That's something that I'm always doing when I'm coming up to a group of sparrows. And Vesper sparrows are often on the ground. They'll hang out with savanna sparrows. They love to flush up to a tree, especially like a 5 to 12 foot tree, where the savanna sparrows almost always go to bushes or go back down to the ground. So that's something I'm always looking for. The other thing that vesper sparrows have is you can see on this bird that white tail feather. So again, if I find a group of savanna sparrows, which are relatively common in Georgia in the winter, I flush them, I'm immediately looking for a white tail and for a bird going up versus a bird going down. And that's often how I find vesper sparrows, which is a tricky bird to find sometimes. All right, so hey, sparrows are down low and they flush different, and they're so neat. Why are they hard? I think they're hard for various reasons. Some of the things that are also the benefits, or what makes sparrows interesting, is also what makes them challenging. They do stay low. So if it's out in the open like this lark sparrow, great. Couldn't be much easier than looking at a bird on barren sand. But often they're tucked in behind vegetation. They're in a dense bush. The grass is too high. They can be kind of skittish. Again, they're on the ground and they're small, which means they are fair game for any predator that can find them. So they tend to be a little skittish compared to some other birds. They don't perch up often, which goes hand in hand with that type of behavior. I already mentioned the running. Many of them will run instead of flying, and will run first. That varies a lot depending on the species, but that can make some birds harder than others. One thing that's always a bummer for me, if I'm like in a mood to go look for some sparrows, and you get out to a grassy area and it's just too windy and the birds just aren't going to come up. You might be able to pick out some songbirds in a tree if it's too windy, because they're still going to be up there. He's got to, look past the moving leaves and things. But if it's grassland and it's howling wind, the birds are not going to perch up on top and bounce all over the place. They're just going to hunker down low. So the wind can be an issue, and just their general desire to skulk, to hide, which kind of fits in with all this. So it's not too uncommon for your first look of a sparrow to be something like this. They can be challenging. They can stay hidden. They require patience, and they also require piecing together identification, maybe bit by bit. You see a little bit, you can eliminate some species. You see a little bit more of the bird, you can eliminate another, and then you finally get that last puzzle piece. Another thing that can be challenging for sparrows is their plumage. There are some general sparrowy things, which we've talked about. They can be streaky. They can have a striped crown. They can have rufous on their cap or some sort of different colored cap. And if one bird had that, that'd be great. That'd be, hey, there's a streaky capped bird. But since 7 of those species can occur in Georgia, they're harder to tease out. You're looking for slighter differences amongst those common characteristics. Sometimes you're relying on one thing. Like if you know anything about savanna sparrows, your field guide will tell you they have bright yellow spots in front of their eyes, which they normally do. But if that's the only thing you're looking for, and you happen to get one of those more drab individuals, it can really throw you. So you need to kind of piece it together with multiple characteristics. And that's kind of how the plumage can be unreliable or be tricky for you. So in the photo here, we have a song sparrow on the right and a Lincoln sparrow on the left. Both brownish, both with striped heads, both with streaky chests, but very different if you see them side by side, but they don't often sit like that for you. And that's kind of how they have the name, LBJs, little brown jobs, which of course, as a sparrow lover, I dismiss that. There's so much more going on, but I understand it. It's a fair enough nickname. But hopefully I'm here to tell you that they're not that tricky, and we can figure all this out together. They live up to the name. Most sparrows have some brown, especially those in our part of the country, our part of the world. There are some tans or some grays. They can be small, they're quick. And again, like I mentioned earlier, sometimes you need to piece together the identification to really get to your final conclusion, versus just seeing a male scarlet tanager or a prothonotary warbler, which are kind of slam dunks once you see them. So this is, I'm cheating here because this is a young bird, which makes it extra tricky, but this is a song sparrow, maybe a couple weeks after leaving the nest, and it's pretty nondescript and brown and streaky and mottled, and would be hard to figure out. Again, I cheated. It's a young bird. Most young birds are challenging, but just to show you how they can live up to that name at times. What also complicates things is that some species are highly variable. They can have a lot of geographic variation. Song sparrows have over 24 different subspecies. So in that upper image, you're seeing a song sparrow on the right, and then that's like an eastern song sparrow, all the way up to one of these Alaskan jumbo song sparrows on the left. You're not going to have to deal with that on a day-to-day basis because we're not getting the Alaskan song sparrows, but still, there's a huge range and lots of plasticity depending on how they look. I already mentioned the yellow on a savanna sparrow. So you can see on the bottom there, the bird on the left, very yellow by the beak. The bird on the right, pretty much none. So it can be quite tricky, that variability within a species. And just to illustrate some of that similarity that you might see where, the top two birds, it's a Lincoln sparrow on the left and a swamp on the right. Again, some streakiness, some reddish in the wing, similar pattern to the face. On the bottom, those birds are pretty different, but they both have the kind of brown and tan or brown and gray striped head. So they're different, but at a quick look, there is a lot of similarity there as well. However, they can be pretty good looking. This is a different white-throated sparrow. You're not going to confuse that if you get a great look at it. That bright yellow superciliary, which is again that laurel yellow area, jet black, pure white head and throat. The Nelson sparrow, one of the most gorgeous sparrows, that beautiful kind of burnt orange color. Henslow sparrows, maybe a bit more subtle, but they almost are purple on the back, and they have this super unique olivey green. So beautiful birds. But sometimes you just have to work a teeny bit to get these great looks, but you can get them. So sparrows, we have all this diversity. They're tricky, but they're amazing and they're hard to find. What are we talking about here in Georgia? So I've talked about sparrows in the tropics and Alaskan song sparrows. We won't mention those anymore, but here in Georgia, there are 26 species that have been seen in our state. 21 of them you can expect to find in a given year if you work really hard and you're lucky. A few of those are very tricky. They constitute or come from 15 different genera, which means there is a good bit of diversity within those 21 species. So some of them are closely related, but there is some distinctiveness genetically between those birds. And this time of year, as well as kind of October and November, are a great time to see sparrows because you have our year-round birds, you have our winter residents, and you might have some early migrants starting to move around a little bit. So here's a breakdown, if you're curious, of kind of the breeding birds, the birds that are primarily just transient or migrants in our area, and those that are winter residents. So we only have what's that, 6 or 8 breeding species, and a few of those, I won't say barely breed in the state, but are very specific or very much tied to a type of habitat. So Bachman sparrow, for example, is again only going to be found or primarily found in longleaf pine forests, which is far less extensive than it used to be. Dark-eyed juncos barely breed on a couple peaks of the North Georgia mountains, so Brasstown Bald, for example, but hard to find breeding elsewhere. Seaside sparrows only in our coastal saltwater marshes. Then the other extreme, you have chipping sparrows and song sparrows, which I would bet almost everyone on this call has in or around their yard. Clay-colored lark sparrows, Lincoln sparrows. Actually, I need to move lark sparrow over to the breeder colony because they've been breeding more frequently in the state. They're primarily a western bird, but we do have some breeding down in the Sandhills. In the southern part of Georgia, there was some breeding up near Rome last year. So that's an interesting bird that I'm not sure if it's expanding or just being detected more frequently in Georgia. But clay-colored and Lincolns are hard birds, mainly just passing through, less common. And then in the winter, we have a whole bunch of birds that come down. Some very common, white-throated swamp sparrow, some very difficult, LeConte sparrow and Henslows as well. But here's kind of the breakdown of the sparrows we have in our state. And then we have the total goofballs, the handful of individuals or the one individual that flew over, like lark bunting on the left or green-tailed towhee. I think there's maybe a couple individuals all time that have been found of these species in Georgia. They're much further west. So green-tailed towhee, that's a bird you can find out in Utah and California. Lark bunting, like the Pawnee grasslands of Colorado. There was a lark bunting that hung out a few years ago in Centennial Olympic Park in Atlanta, a very lost young bird. So it's birds, weird things happen, but these aren't expected. All right, so for half an hour or so, I just talked about wing shape and conical bills and superciliaries and, saltwater marshes. And, you guys probably just want to hopefully learn a little about sparrows, but get better identifying them. So why did I think this was important? Because so much of your bird identification and your bird watching and becoming a better birder is to understand these things to help you be ready to identify that bird when it pops up. If you know, okay, it's wintertime, grasshopper sparrow is probably not going to be a bird I'm going to see. So you can't completely forget it because again, birds do weird things, but you can start narrowing your possibilities down. What part of the state am I in? Okay, I'm in Columbus. I'm not going to see a seaside sparrow. I'm out in a completely open grassland. I'm not going to find a fox sparrow here. They do not like that. So the more you can pick up on a species ecology and their natural history and their behaviors and their preferences, that's how you can start to narrow your list of birds down and become quicker at identifying what you're looking for. And I think this is true and helpful for all birds, but I think is really good for sparrows as well. So thinking about what it's doing, where it's doing it, how it's doing it, the structure and shape of the bird versus just the plumage, I think that will all help you become a better sparrow lover and sparrow identifier. Another thing to kind of check this is to use eBird or other resources that are out there, the Georgia Online Birders, Georgia Birding Online, Gabo, social media. So if you next fall want to go, hey, I really want to go see a Henslow sparrow, which good luck. You can say, okay, it's October 10th. I'm going to type in Henslow sparrows to see when they're seen in Georgia. Okay, they start showing up the last week of September. This is an eBird bar chart, by the way. And if you know nothing about this, we at Georgia Audubon periodically offer eBird workshops. Like, okay, Henslows show up in Georgia sometime in October. I live in the Atlanta area. Where can I go find them? Okay, here are the spots of Henslow sparrows have been found around Atlanta. And I know that they like open grasslands and so forth, and I'm going to go look for them here. So, it's a long shot with Henslow sparrow, but at least you're kind of thinking about where they might turn up and what type of habitat they might be in and what time of year you should go look for them. And so again, if chipping sparrows, these habitat associations where you can kind of predict what birds you're looking for are really helpful. Chipping sparrows tend to be on edges or open areas with mature trees nearby. They're very accommodating or happy to be in an urban or suburban environment. Grasshopper sparrows love really short grass, which often in our kind of modified landscape is agricultural fields. So they'll be out on bare soil amongst cattle and things. Swamp sparrows, big surprise, they like wet grassy areas. Vespers, sandy, barren grounds with those trees that they can flush to. There you go. And if you look at a field guide, you'll notice that most of these birds, or most of them will have an image like this. And the bird that they show is a sparrow. Because the sparrows, even though they might not be the most colorful, they have amazing patterning. And so they're often the bird in the field guide because they have a crown, they have a supercilium, they have a laurel mark, they have brightly colored lores and a malar marking. So learning some of these terms is helpful for identifying sparrows, and I'll try to not use too many technical terms the rest of the talk. With all birding, but especially with sparrows, it's good to have that, what in the birding world they call like the gist, the overall feel of the bird, the general impression you get, the structure, how it moves, the gestalt, that there's something collectively about this bird that just tells me, hey, that's a swamp sparrow. And that kind of birding by feel, which comes with a lot of practice, it'll devalue some of the things that can be unreliable, like lighting, like reliance on a single trait or male, female. The feathers could be wonky, a bird could be molting. But if you kind of work on that search engine of just that feels like this, that feels like that, it's not foolproof, but it'll help narrow down. So like I know if I'm walking on a edge of a pond or a grassy area and I see a pretty dark sparrow shoot out, sometimes with a brighter reddy brown, instantly I'm going to think swamp sparrow, and then I can double check myself, and often that's correct. They're much grayer than some of the other birds that are going to be in that habitat. But birding by shape and size is kind of something that's really being prioritized more or highlighted as a better way to work on your identification skills the past 10 or 15 years. Really focusing on shape and structure. And this is kind of helpful, but also somewhat comical because some of these are barely different. But the oversimplification, but really getting that shape and structure down on some of these birds is really going to be helpful. Okay, a whole lot of background on the sparrows. I think if you're a Georgia birder, the very first thing that you should do to becoming a sparrow pro is to really, really, really learn the song sparrow. You probably all think you know a song sparrow or think you can figure it out, which I believe you can, but really get it down so that when you see one or hear one or think about one, you know it. I'm not saying you ignore them, even though sometimes I ignore song sparrows, but it's so helpful to just be like, that's a song sparrow or that's not a song sparrow. Because if you can put it in the that's not a song sparrow category, you can start looking for some other, maybe more exciting in the moment, species. So really learn the song sparrow. They're common. They're across various habitats. They're across the entire country. They tend to be less secretive than some of these other birds we've been talking about that are going to run on the sandy dirt out in the field. They'll perch up and they'll give you a good look most of the time. They're year-round in most of the state. So I think if you can really hammer song sparrow and then just know 90-some% of the time, that's a song sparrow, that's something else. For me, I think that's a major milestone to get over to mastering or getting more comfortable with song sparrow or with sparrows more broadly, excuse me. Now, I told you song sparrows can be tricky because they have a lot of subspecies. The good thing is this is only going to matter if you're traveling out west in Georgia. Most birds kind of look like the upper right individual, but they are pretty unique in how variable they can be. So if you don't know your song sparrow, or if you're thinking about, okay, what do I need to key in on to really get it? They're a medium-sized sparrow, so they're kind of right in the middle of the pack. Again, kind of stocky. The main things most people are going to see is they're heavily streaked, and it kind of extends down their sides, down their flanks. They have kind of a grayish head with some of those brown stripes mixed in. They have a postocular, so a line that extends from behind the eye. You can kind of see that brown line right there. And it heavily contrasts with the gray eyebrow. So it's got that gray and brown striped head. It normally has pretty thick malar markings. Again, kind of like that Fu Manchu type look. Reddish wings, but most people are going to key in on that streaking in the gray and reddy brown head. They often also will have a breast spot or a stick pin. So in the middle of the streaking, you'll tend to get a clump that's there. But again, we're not going to rely on just one characteristic, but that one is very helpful. There are a few other birds that have that as well. Most birds, again, kind of look more like the one on the left. The streaking on the one on the right is kind of unique, but streaking, center spot, brown and gray head is kind of what you're looking for. Not only the streaking, but it has white behind the streaking. How do they behave? How can that help you? Well, surprise, they're normally down kind of low. They will perch up in bushes. They'll visit feeders, which is a great time for you to practice them. They will not be too scared off by humans. They will respond to pishing. If you know what that call is, sometimes birds will respond to that. Song sparrows are generally one of the stronger birds to respond. One thing that's very helpful is they are kind of poor flyers, or at least they give that appearance. So we talked about flushing birds. When you're walking and if you're seeing a song sparrow and you see it fly away from you, they almost always drop their tail. So it kind of looks like they're laboring a little bit. They tend to do shorter flights. So a short flight that looks labored with a dangling tail. Again, that takes some practice, but that will point you towards a song sparrow, which is really helpful compared to a savanna sparrow, which we're going to talk about later, or the Vesper sparrow I mentioned earlier. I'll try to play a quick song here. Normally there's a few clear notes followed by like a kind of a jumble. Hopefully you can hear that. It's not just in my earbuds. A little more. All right. Oh. And then one more, there's this call. A lot of sparrows give a high-pitched type call, but these song sparrows will do a jimp type noise. A little bit lower, a little bit raspier. It's 100% identifiable just from that call. So if you happen to hear that, then it's really helpful. Other sparrow calls can be kind of tricky or take a lot of practice to learn those. I mentioned they're nationwide at various seasons. highest concentration in the Midwest during the breeding season. And what I think is if you can say song sparrow, not a song sparrow, when you start breaking down why a bird isn't a song sparrow, it'll start pointing out those traits that will lead you to the identification of the other species. So, okay, brown and gray head, streaky bird. Looks like it's got a little spot in the chest. This must be a song sparrow. But then you look a little bit more closely and you go, those streaks look a little bit neater. So what I always say with song sparrows is it looks like someone drew their streaking with a crayon. These streaks are a little bit neater, maybe a colored pencil or something like that. So the streaking there is just a little bit different because song sparrows, I remember Adam saying how messy they were and they run together. That bird does have that malar marking, but it doesn't have that dark Fu Manchu. It's got this beautiful like tan color coming in. And that tan color is behind the streaking, and song sparrows are normally white. So again, that's a few things that you probably want to, memorize or that you over time you would pick up. But the quality of the streaking is a big one. Song sparrows are crayon messy streaks. This bird has very beautiful, neat streaks. And all that tan, that means that this bird's a Lincoln sparrow and not a song sparrow. So, song sparrow, we're going to master it. You know it already, hopefully. We're going to know it even better. How can we break up the other species? So there's kind of 4 general groupings, some of it rooted in their taxonomy, which makes sense. And I'm sorry to throw out the Latin terms, but it'll make more sense, I think. There's the Melospisa sparrows and or the other streaky sparrows. These are birds that mainly have that chest streaking like a song sparrow. You have the Spazellas. Those are the small, dainty sparrows. They tend to not be marked or very lightly marked underneath. The Amodromus sparrows and friends, when I started this presentation years ago, they were all Amodromus. Now they've been broken up and the experts out there think they're actually different genuses. These birds all kind of have funky head shapes. Excuse me. Flat heads, chunky beaks. And then you have the Zonotrichia, which are the crown striped ones and the biggest chunkers out there. And I feel like if you can put it in one of these buckets or one of these buckets and other, again, you're just narrowing it down a little bit. So I'm trying to give you lots of things from habitat to behavior to general grouping to just make your decision-making between 2 species and not 8 species. Look at that shape, size, structure, all that good stuff. So what are these other streaky birds I'm talking about? We got song sparrow, swamp sparrow, Lincolns. Those are all very closely related in that Melospisa. That's the genus. And then you have some others, Savannah, Vesper, and Fox. So like the upper left bird, that's a Savannah sparrow. The bottom, maybe you remember now, that's a Lincoln sparrow because they love that beautiful tan color behind. And then the fox sparrow on the upper right, they almost have like little arrowheads in their streaking, which is really pretty. All right, so we're all masters of the song sparrow now, or at least we're going to work on it. Swamp sparrow is another bird that's very common here in the winter, often in close proximity to song sparrows. So these birds are very similar in size to a song sparrow, a little bit smaller, but I'd be lying if I could tell you just from the size, which is which. These birds have brighter chestnutty, browny red on the crown and on the wing, big time. It contrasts a good bit with the gray that's on their face, extending to their chest and the back of their neck. Again, I mentioned earlier for a swamp sparrow, they're just darker. Almost always, they're darker. So they just give off that darker vibe when they're flying away from you. And that makes that rufous on the wing really pop most of the time you see it. Way less streaking than a song sparrow and a Lincoln sparrow, though sometimes they can have kind of very faint stripes. And they do have that postocular line like a song sparrow, but in general, their head striping is very different because they have that complete cap. So again, perched up like that, you'll figure out a swamp sparrow, but sparrows don't always do that for you. The other thing that's tricky is age and sex and other slight variances between the swamp sparrow. The bottom left bird is like a young winter bird. That's probably what we see a lot of here in Georgia. The middle bird is a peak breeding bird, which unfortunately we don't get here too often, but come April or May, they'll start looking more and more like this. And you can kind of get anything in between these. You'll get birds that kind of look like the one on the bottom, but will have a bright red head, or a bird that has a bright red head, but doesn't have quite the bright red wing. There's always a little bit of variation, but in general, darker, grayer up front, some sort of reddy brown on top, which can be quite bright red, and almost no streaking on the chest. So as we've talked about, they're swamp lovers. They love wet, grassy areas. They're a common winter bird in the southeast. Surprise, surprise, they're down low, which makes sense where the swampy vegetation is. Um, the call is a really sharp, high-pitched call, which I know it's distinct if you have some practice with swamp sparrows or with sparrows. It might just sound like a pretty generic high-pitched call, but it's really piercing. So if you are out on the edge of a marsh, it is distinct if you give it some study. There's song I can play for you, but again, we maybe only hear it for a little while during the late spring before these birds migrate up north, and it sounds a lot like some other birds we hear frequently, like a chipping sparrow or even like a pine warbler. Pretty generic trill type song. Skip ahead. The call is much more helpful, that clear, distinct, piercing call from the marshes. So on the left there, you can see a swamp sparrow and a song sparrow interacting. Right away, look how much darker the swamp sparrow is. Look at the streaking of the song sparrow and look how the head pattern's different. So again, if they're giving you that look, it's going to be very helpful. The upper right bird is a young swamp sparrow, and the white throat on the bottom, they look different, but it wouldn't be crazy for you to confuse those two with a quick look. But the back of the color, the size, the type of striping is all a little bit different. All right, song sparrow, most common streaky Melospisa bird. Swamp sparrows, pretty common, very little streaking. Next is Lincoln's. Lincoln's is a challenging bird to get in Georgia. If I'm lucky, I'll see one or two a year, but there are definitely years I don't see Lincoln sparrow in our state. These birds are even more small and delicate compared to the last two I showed you. Shorter bill or shorter tail, finer bill. Again, the quality of the streaking is really helpful. And that beautiful tan gold colors all throughout their upper parts. So again, through the chest, extending down the side, sometimes up through the face, even around the eye can be that color, can be pretty clean white too. But the type of streaking and that beautiful color is really helpful. And it just, again, that size and structure, it's not drastic, but they do look different. They feel smaller when you see them out in the woods. They feel a little bit more dainty compared to the chunky song and swamp sparrows. They're also just a winter or migratory species here in Georgia. They're a little bit more mysterious, I guess is the word I use, but they stay hidden. They're not going to perch up as frequently. Normally, if you have a flock of song sparrows and swamp sparrows and chipping sparrows, and then maybe working a bush row, the Lincoln's is almost always the one that's always a little bit tucked in deeper, or will come out just for a little bit and scurry back in. They're a little more shy compared to the others. Again, that's a generalization, but it holds true for the most part. And hard to see in our state, mainly Atlanta and kind of Northwest, but they'll pop up anywhere. But they're a hard but subtly beautiful bird to find. And so here are the three Melospisas. I've used these photos already, but again, swamp on the left, almost no streaking, darker gray, not pure white on the chest, rufous on the wings, sometimes a really bright cap. Then you have the slightly daintier, thinner Lincoln sparrow with the fine streaks and all that tanny gold. And then the song sparrow with that crayon and messy striping, often a center spot, and then that brown and gray cap. All closely related, same genus, all possible at the exact same time in one flock in Georgia. But with just a little bit of practice, not too challenging. So those are our Melospisas, but there are other streaky ones that can be confusing. And another one that's pretty common here for about half the year is the Savannah sparrow. So it shares a lot of the same major characteristics as a song sparrow, even though there are some pretty easy ways to tell them apart most of the time. It is streaking, or a streak, excuse me. It normally has a center chest spot. It has that patterned head with a paler eyebrow. There are multiple subspecies, which makes them a little bit tricky. But there are some major differences. They're smaller, shorter tailed, shorter beak than a song sparrow. They have a notched tail compared to a more rounded tail of a song sparrow. But the big things that are helpful is they have yellow typically in the lores. They're just more pale all over. They have less of that gray and kind of chocolatey reddy brown. They're more white and like a tanny, paler brown. Like the Lincoln Sparrow, they have very fine streaking. So maybe like a ballpoint pen instead of that crayon that you're going to get on a song sparrow. Pale white below typically. The other thing, which is really helpful, is their behavior and their habitat. Savanna sparrows like open grassy areas. They don't often hang out in too wooded of a space. They will be in like a row of bushes or things like that, but you'll find them walking out in short grass. A song sparrow is rarely going to do that. A song sparrow is going to be in a bush, it's going to be in a tree, it's going to be on the edge of a forest, where a savanna sparrow is going to be out in a simple open area, often running before they fly, where a song sparrow is going to do that little weak flight with its tail drooping down. Savanna sparrows are much stronger flyers. So when you do see one flying away, again, a song sparrow often goes like 5-10 feet and plops down. A savanna sparrow, sometimes when it takes off, and it's going for 50, 100, 500 feet before it lands again. The other thing with savanna sparrows is oftentimes when you find them, they're in a group of savanna sparrows. Song sparrows are mixed in with chipping and with field and with swamp and Lincolns and a whole hodgepodge. Savanna sparrows will mix with a couple, but because of their habitat preference, you often get a flock of savanna sparrows. It could be 4 or it could be 50, but they tend to stick together. I'm going to skip their call. Their call is a super, super soft, high-pitched call. Takes some real practice. Now, these are kind of unfair a little bit because that photo on the left is obviously a bit overexposed, but you do get a wide range on how richly colored these birds are, how bright the yellow is, or the yellow can almost be completely lacking, how streaked they are. But in general, they're much paler than a song sparrow. They have a little bit of yellow. They have that pink bill, and they're going to be in open habitats. We have a savanna sparrow on the left and that kind of interesting song sparrow I showed you on the right. Savanna sparrows can get that pin or that center spot, but not often as big and chunky as the song sparrow. And again, I said this song sparrow on the right is a bit of an extreme case because it has relatively fine streaking instead of that crayon streaking. But again, that thick Fu Manchu, that gray and reddy brown versus the tan and the pure white of a savanna sparrow. That bottom photo is a bad one, but it's of an extreme case of a savanna sparrow that's a little bit darker and really oddly streaked, just to show you the variability that's possible. But in general, different beak shapes and colors, different streaking types, different back colors. When you see them side by side, they're not that similar, but man, in the field with a quick look, they can be complicated. Another bird that's streaky, we have the Vesper sparrow. Often in kind of the same areas as savannas. I forget what book I quoted this from, but a real chunker of a sparrow. Large head, large pink bill. They have that little bit of chestnut on their wing. Sometimes that's more obvious than it is in this photo. White in the tail, like I showed you earlier. Super helpful when they're flying away from you. Pale, very similar to a savanna sparrow, but a few things that pop with these birds is that eye ring. Sometimes they look very bug-eyed, as you can see in some of these pictures. So again, bug-eyed white eye ring, the white in the tail, which you can see in that bottom left bird. If you look at the middle photo, they have this white that kind of outlines their cheek. And some people say it looks like there's a V on their face, V for Vesper. And that bottom middle bird is kind of showing off. But as you can see, not every bird gives you that look or that much white. But the white around their face, the white around their eye, the white in the tail. So again, white, 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 some streaking, but no center breast spot. And if you remember behaviorally, they're going to almost always come off the ground and they're going to fly up to a tree, a small to medium-sized tree. Something that savanna sparrows don't do. And it's surprisingly helpful in picking out a Vesper sparrow when it flies away from you. So because of that, they like old pastures, they like sandy areas, they like grassy fields. I kind of mentioned this other stuff here. I got ahead of myself. On the ground, go to a perch, hang out with savannas. They like to run and hop before they fly, which is pretty consistent with those open birds, open country birds. So there's a side-by-side with a Vesper on the left, savanna on the right, similar quality of streaking. The Vesper has that white around the face and that white eye ring, where the savanna does not have either of those. and it has that little bit of yellow. So they can be somewhat similar. Vespers, again, are going to be bigger. Remember, they're a real chunker, and they have that white in the tail. So this is a lot. It's not like you're going to memorize all this from one presentation, but there are a few things, and especially behavioral and habitat associations, that will help get you to the identification that you're looking for. And the last streaky one that we're going to talk about is by far the most distinctive. Hard to confuse it. You'd be more likely to confuse it for a thrasher than another sparrow, probably. Big guys, thick neck, round head, almost more like a towhee. Just absolutely stunning birds. The ones in the east are the red subspecies of the fox sparrow. There are 4 different subspecies, but ours are very red. They have those beautiful triangle arrowhead type streaks on their chest, a mix of red and gray on the face that almost looks like it's an incomplete facial pattern. A really gorgeous bird. So the ones that we're going to see are kind of the top 2 individuals. The bottom ones are some of those western subspecies. But yeah, just kind of blotchy. They're one of my favorite birds, if that's not coming through already. They're really cool birds. And these birds do tend to be a bit more forested. Lots of leaf litter under like some magnolia trees or some oak trees. Great spot to find fox sparrows. You're not going to see them out picking, grass seeds with savanna sparrows and vespers. They're going to be somewhere else. They're much more likely to interact with like a whitethroat or a song sparrow. A bird that's not the easiest, but here all winter. Again, they're leaf tossing like towhees. You can see they have a wide range. They have a beautiful song, and they actually sing somewhat regularly in the winter. Sorry if that was loud. Coming again, I think. Really beautiful song. You will hear that kind of randomly some mornings down here in Georgia during the winter months. Let's see if it does it one more time. And also their call, some people say, is a smack. It's pretty emphatic, pretty loud. So if you do get one that's agitated near you, that call can be distinctive with a little bit of practice, or identifiable. So that was our last streaky guy. So we got all these streaky birds. So again, you're out. It's not a song sparrow. It's streaky. Then you narrowed it to those 4, more or less. So with swamp sparrows being barely streaky, fox sparrows being very unique, and then the trickier ones in between. The spazellas are these small ones. They're unmarked, generally speaking. They tend to have more gray. They can almost look more like a cage bird, like a little finch, delicate. And in Georgia, we have 2, 3 species that are reliable or gettable most years. By far the most common is our chipping sparrow. And most of these birds, especially chipping sparrows, you're going to get big flocks of them. They fly up higher to trees. So all these other birds I mentioned are down low. Chipping sparrows are year round. They're on the ground. They're hanging out on your driveway. But when you scare them, they go up pretty high into a pine tree, for example. So you'll see them in parks doing that type of behavior. In the breeding season, they'll shrink their group down to just their family. And then in the winter, you can get huge flocks of chipping sparrows. So from a plumage standpoint in the breeding season, they're pretty obvious. Bright, reddy chestnut cap, kind of like that swamp sparrow, pure white eyebrow, black eye line. So it's behind the eye, that postocular, but it's also up in the lower. So it's a whole eye line all the way through it. Not a drop of streaking on this bird, which makes it easy. A little forked tail, which is not going to be a major helpful tip, but it is there. And that jet black beak during the breeding season. If you just see the top of a spazella sparrow's head and their beak, you can actually identify it, which I'll show you here in a minute. I'm going to skip these just for the sake of time, but the chipping sparrow, their song is I'll play it. It's very much like a pine warbler, very high pitch. Just goes and goes and goes. We have a few birds that sing like that. Pine warblers, dark-eyed juncos, chipping sparrows, worm-eating warblers, and even swamp sparrows. They can be very difficult to tell apart. So the song is not always the best thing, but if you hear that kind of trill in your yard or the park and it's down low, probably a chipping sparrow. Pine warblers are higher up and normally a bit more musical in their song. Where these birds get a little more tricky is in the winter because they don't have that beautiful chestnut cap and they kind of lose that pure white and jet black look on their face. but they do keep that eye line. And they do keep a little color on top of their head. They don't pick up the streaking. So they're still pretty easy. That black beak turns to pink, which can make it tricky. So look for that eye line, small dainty bird, that forked tail, and that colored cap, that reddish cap, even if it's not quite as bright. Now, the most likely bird maybe that you'd confuse it for would be a clay colored. You're going to see, I don't know, 3,000 chipping sparrows for every one clay colored you see in Georgia if you're lucky. So clay colors are tricky, but they will be in those flocks of chipping if you look closely enough. So these differences are kind of slight. They take some practice. One thing that pops out is that lure. So remember, the chipping sparrow, no matter the time of the year, black all the way through the eye, front and back. The clay color does not have the dark in front of the eye. It gives it more of an open-faced appearance, a little bit softer. So that's really helpful. One thing that's helpful is the rump. For your bird anatomy, the rump is on top at the base at the top of the tail. You can see on the left, the chipping sparrow has a gray rump. The clay colored, which I don't have a good photo of here, their rump is clayish, tanny brown. So the rump is helpful. So I remember that the first time I ever saw a clay colored sparrow, it flushed out of a group with literally 300 chipping sparrows, and it popped out because the back of it just looks so different in color. So they can look quite similar, but if you get a breeding clay colored sparrow or a good looking adult, they're pretty distinct. But that eye line and the rump color and the overall color of the birds are quite distinct if you're looking with a sharp enough eye. Juvenile chipping sparrows will really throw you for a loop because all of a sudden they're mottled like crazy and they got speckling and they got this weird afro, like little crazy hairdo, a mohawk. That's what I was trying to say. But again, that dark eye line, it's always there. And they're always going to be small and dainty and kind of long-tailed compared to the other sparrows. The other expected or common bird in this group is the field sparrow. They have this really beautiful reddish pink color throughout their head and side of their face. Their beak is always bubblegum pink, really pops out. Very plain faced. So if we go back a little bit, see these guys all have all these markings, dark eye lines and auriculars, kind of cheek patches that are outlined and throat markings. Field sparrows are much softer throughout their entire face. And like a Vesper sparrow, they have a really bug-eyed look. It's a big dark eye with a big white ring around it that really will pop. So the pink of the head and the beak with that soft face and a bulging eyeball is going to get you to field sparrow pretty easily. They like bushy habitat and taller grass, overgrown fields, the edge of forests, blackberries and briars. They will hunker down though. They're pretty common. I'll often hear them or see them, and they'll just sit 3 feet off the ground in a bush and they just won't move sometimes, which can be very tricky. Like savanna sparrows, they also like to flock together. They tend to stick with field sparrows. So you will get field and chipping mixed together, but oftentimes fields are with field sparrows. And their song is one of my favorites. People say it sounds like a ball that's bouncing. It kind of speeds up as it goes. A really sweet whistle that kind of ascends. It speeds up as it goes. A common song if you're out in the Piedmont of Georgia in the breeding season at the edge of a field, you'll definitely hear some field sparrows. And there's some more. These birds to me always look like stuffed toys. They're a plush toy version of a New World sparrow. The last one, which I'll barely even mention, American tree sparrow. This is a northern bird. I've lived in Georgia for almost 8 years. I think there's been like 2 sightings of an American tree sparrow. They're the biggest of that grouping of 4. They have a bicolored bill. So all the other ones never had a black bill or they had a pink bill. This one's black and yellow. They have that breast spot. So it's kind of weird. It's like a song sparrow with a breast spot, but no streaking. So you're unlikely to stumble across one of these in Georgia, but keep your eyes peeled on a cold winter day. But really pretty bird, much more common up in Ohio and Indiana in the wintertime. And they go way far north for their breeding season. So we have the striped sparrows. We have the dainty unstriped ones, except for the one spot one. Then we have these oddball, flat-headed, really cool sparrows, which all used to be neatly bundled in this genus called the Amodromys sparrows, and that made my presentation nice. And then the taxonomists came and said, actually, they're in 3 different genuses, and kind of completely blew up my structure for my talk here. But I just kind of changed it, and now I just call them the flat-headed or chunky sparrows. These birds tend to have very specific habitat preferences, and they tend to be marshy or on the edges of water. These of the birds I've talked about, these are the ones you maybe you're least familiar with. They're hard. They're hard to access habitats. They're very mousy. They like to stay low. They're just tricky birds. But they can be really beautiful if you get them in the right light. So these are the ones that are possible in Georgia. Some are very tricky. Grasshopper sparrow and seaside sparrow breed. So seaside sparrow on the right. And then we have a few that overwinter or are here just in migration. Grasshopper sparrow is still in that Amodromys genus. They're plain, they're buffy, beautiful kind of oranges throughout their face. They have that bulging eye ring as well, which really helps. Very little streaking. They're very stout, big-headed, kind of attenuated, kind of drawn out a little bit. They're going to be out on barren, low ground. Again, think where cattle are grazing, dry fields. They're not going to be by the marsh like all the other birds in their grouping here. You can hear them. They'll be 15 feet in front of you, and they still can be very hard to see sometimes. Like song sparrows, they often don't do huge flights. They tend to do little flights. They tend to stay low and do little movements. They have their spiky head sometimes, spiky tail. And I've never seen a flock of grasshopper sparrows. I think I've maybe seen a couple individuals at a time. Normally, when you find them in the breeding season, they're along a fence post, kind of marking their little territory out in the grassy area. But a really subtly beautiful bird that can be sometimes tricky. Their sound or their name is because they sound very insect-like with their song. That was it, that kind of buzzy call. Not that one, that one. So sounds like a grasshopper a little bit. They're here just in the breeding season. Go up to north of Atlanta. If you're in this part of the state, go to Bartow County. You can find them breeding in just a couple months. Henslow sparrows are the opposite. They're only here in the winter. They're far less common than grasshopper sparrows at any point throughout the year. They like things a bit wetter. They'll tolerate a little bit more woody vegetation than a grasshopper sparrow, but they do not like to perch up. They're not often doing it like this photo is showing here. Very secretive and very low to the ground. But again, they're going to be their head looks oversized. They have that big beak, flat-headed, looks kind of slicked back with the top of their head. They're pretty heavily marked, and they have that really unique olivey green throughout their head and face. Very boldly patterned, especially on the back. They almost have I mentioned earlier, like a purple tip to some of their feathers. They have that outline of the Fu Manchu. It's not full on dark and spread like a song sparrow, but just a little bit. So these birds tend to be pretty heavily patterned. They're just hard to get a good look at them. And there's the Henslow sparrow. I'm going to skip their song. It's the most pathetic little bird song you've ever heard. It's barely anything, but very beautiful olive color on their head. So that's a comparison. Henslow sparrow on the right, grasshopper sparrow on the left. But again, those birds rarely overlap in our state. Grasshopper sparrows are normally down in Mexico when Henslow sparrows are here. And as Henslow sparrows depart, grasshopper sparrows come back. So the habitats aren't quite right, and their seasonal movement doesn't match up. But of course, if you get a good look like this, they are somewhat distinct. The color on the face, the eye ring, the habitat type. Grasshoppers have less streaking. As you can see on the left, they don't have the dark markings like the Henslow sparrow does. But structurally, they're kind of similar. And of course, there's this third little difficult beauty down here called the LeConte sparrow with that beautiful orange color. The hardest of the 3 to see in Georgia. There's always a couple that pop up. I think they just hang out where there aren't that many people. They're not here in big numbers. They will tolerate a bit more of a dry area. So again, grasshopper sparrows out in the bare, low grass. Henslow sparrows, a little wet grass with some woody sticks here and there. LeConte's like just expansive, dry grass or wet grassland type areas. That orange is really unique. Kind of this auburny color on the back of their neck, on their nape. very heavily patterned, that white streaks coming down the white and black on their back. A hard bird to find in the winter months, but they are around and worthy of a good search if you think they could be there. So those three can all be inland. Grasshopper sparrows breeding in cow pastures, LeContes in big grassy areas on the inland parts of our state. Henslows, they'll get a little bit closer to the coastal areas, like there's a good spot down near Brunswick to find them, but they're not in the salt marsh. These three species are salt-loving birds in general. Of course, there has to be a caveat, but salt marsh sparrows, Nelson sparrows, and seaside sparrows. Seaside sparrows are breeders. They're only in the coastal areas, very poor flight. Some people say their song kind of sounds like, sizzling pan. Real basic song. Super dark gray, yellow in the beak, or yellow behind the beak, excuse me, white in the throat. Then there are the sharp-tailed sparrows. So the seasides here year-round, they breed. These guys are only here in the winter months, and they look extremely similar at times. Nelson sparrow normally has a softer orangey wash, as you can see on the left. Salt marsh tend to be more heavily patterned. They tend to have more white in the throat. They typically have a darker face patch. They're a little bit more flat-headed, but they can be very tricky. The other tricky component is that Nelson sparrows has two different subspecies, and we can have both of them in Georgia. They're both kind of orangey. Some can be rather bright. I showed you one earlier. This one's kind of a medium orangey tan color. And it's probably from the interior breeding population, kind of up in central US and Canada. That orangey color, a little bit of gray on the cheek, a gray central crown stripe, just not too strongly patterned and a little bit more delicate looking. This is a real oddball. This is from the coastal breeding where they lose a lot of that orange, but again, not heavily marked. They're going to keep some of that orange color. Again, this is an extreme case, but this will show you the variation. That bird and that bird are the same species. And then compare that to a salt marsh. This photo might be a little bit overexposed, but again, much more bold streaking, white up through the throat. It looks tough, tough expression. But that pale breast with streaking is kind of the main thing to key in on. They're a little bit larger, that head shape, that longer beak. Very slight differences, but they are there. So these two are very similar. Nelson's on the left and a salt marsh on the right. Sometimes, even in the hand, they can look tricky. But again, on the left, a little bit paler throat, more heavily marked in the chest, slightly darker all over. They're hard, and they're very, very hard. They look similar. They're in difficult habitats, but they're gorgeous. And if you do find them in the field, you can't tell them apart. It just takes a little bit of practice. But the tough birds. And then finally, to try to wrap us up here in time, the Zonotrichia species. These are ones that tend to have black crowned heads, or in this case, a Harris's sparrow, black all over the face, big round bellied sparrows, pretty striking. This is the only image I have of a Harris's sparrow. Very hard bird in Georgia. They're not annual, one every few years if we're lucky, more of a central flyway bird. But very pretty. We also have golden crown in the Southwest, and I showed you rufous colored earlier, which is the tropical one. White crown is the least common of the two that we normally get. They have that nice, clean black and white striped head, a yellow or pink beak, only here in the winter months. One thing that's tricky is some people think this is a female and this bird is a male. That's not the case. Males and females both look like this. These are young birds. Well, you see a lot of them. They just kind of substitute that black and white for a brown and gray. No streaking, and again, pretty good sized bird. Now compare that to the much more common white-throated sparrow. These are all over the state in the winter months. They go up to the boreal forest, as I mentioned, to breed. They have that striped head, but they also have that very distinct throat pattern, and they have that yellow spot, which you're not going to see in the white crowned. And sometimes they get a little bit of streaking, but that's not something I would really key in on. Normally they're unstreaked. And these are the coolest birds because this is the species I told you I did a lot of research with. This is me about a decade ago, banding lots of babies. And here's a video on the right of a female coming to feed her nestlings with a whole bunch of insects. So again, they're mainly seed eaters, but in the breeding season, they'll eat blueberries and fruits, and they'll eat a lot of insects, especially for their babies. So why is this brown bird the coolest bird? It's because they got so much going on that's kind of hidden in plain sight. These birds are dimorphic. So I told you most sparrows, they look the same, males and females. In this bird, males and females actually do look the same in theory. What they have going on here is they have two different morphs in that there are white-throated sparrows and tan white-throated sparrows, which is what you're seeing on the left. A white male or white bird on the left, tan bird on the right. And you can kind of see, going back to genetics class, if you're still with me after an hour and 20 minutes, on the bottom left here, that's chromosome is pinched in the middle. And because of that pinch, the genes that are there affect the color of the bird's head. It affects their behavior. White birds sing more often. They're less parental. They cheat on their social partner more often. Tan birds are more parental. They don't cheat on the social partner. They even will distribute themselves differently in the ecosystem on where they're nesting. So you have white birds and tan birds. Both males and females can be white or tan. And what's really cool is they cross mate. So white males mate with tan females and tan males with white females 98, 99% of the time. So there's this very cool plumage, behavior, genetic combination all within this bird that is almost certainly in your backyard right now. Tan or young birds tend to look like tan individuals like this, so they can look a little bit more drab. Swamp sparrow can be kind of confusing, as I showed you earlier, but in general, these birds are less rufous. The white-throats are less rufous. They have a darker crown, they're bigger, and they have that clear white throat with a little bit of yellow behind the eye. That shows you some of the variation. An adult white on the left and a young tan morph bird on the right. You can see how it goes from no streaking to a little bit of streaking, white versus tan, school bus yellow versus spicy brown mustard type yellow. And of course, there are other species that are here. Dark-eyed juncos on the right. Those are pretty obvious. You're not going to confuse those from most other sparrows. They're that beautiful slate and white color. Lark sparrows are so uniquely patterned. They're hard to mix up, and they're pretty uncommon across the state. And then we have backman sparrows. These are the birds that are endemic to our region. They're only found in the southeast, but they really only like longleaf pine or longleaf pine adjacent areas. You're not going to get them in your backyard unless you happen to have some timber out back. They're closely associated with red-cockaded woodpeckers because these are both birds that need fire, need longleaf pine ecosystems. They're kind of in between a Melospisa, like a streaky sparrow, and one of these Amodromus because they do kind of have a flat head and a bigger beak, but they're very rich, reddy brown all over, and the habitat is really helpful. So it's worth going to a longleaf pine stand to try to find these birds. A really cool species that I always make an effort to go find each year. Eastern towhees, a sparrow, but again, very distinct. Jet black for the male. Some birds in our state have bright red eyes. Some have bright white eyes. You have the female on the right. She's pretty obvious also with the brown. The trickier one is when April, May, June comes along and you get these juvenile Eastern towhees kicking around. They kind of look like they could be something different, but their size, again, they're kind of big, and that triangular kind of beak is helpful. They also show some white patches in their wings, so those could be a little bit tricky. But in general, those are all sparrows that are a little bit easier to pick up: juncos, towhees, lark sparrows. And then the sparrow that isn't a sparrow in the context of tonight's talk, house sparrow. Again, they're not that closely related. They're introduced from the old world. They're actually becoming less common, not only here where they're not really desired, but even in their native range back in the UK, they're becoming less and less common. Males have some black on their throat. It's quite variable. Females are rather drab like this. They can be aggressive. They're cavity nesters, but you're more likely to find those not in a grassland or a marsh, but the Chick-fil-A drive-through or the garden center at a Home Depot. And there are so many birds that look like sparrows that aren't, that people think are and struggle with. There's a Facebook page, if you're on social media, called What's This Bird, that the ABA, American Birding Association, runs. It's a fun one to be a part of. And you can submit some of your tricky photos there. So female finches, house finch on the left, purple on the right. They're brown, they're streaking, but they're up in trees. Their beaks are different. Structurally, they're different. Again, structure and shape and size is really crucial. Indigo buntings, again, it's just because they're brown. I think people make that mistake in their seed crunching beak, but quite different, uniform, no streaking, and normally there's going to be a touch of blue on there somewhere. Grosbeaks, again, the beak's very different. rose-breasted, which is on the right, that's going to be up in a tree. Blue grosbeak normally has some blue on the wing, but again, they're different, structurally very different, but the color, I think, can throw you off. Even bobolinks, which are blackbirds, if you get females or males in winter plumage, they're a little more yellow, but they're down, they're eating seeds. You can see how they might be mistaken for a sparrow. But again, structure, shape is totally different. Same with a red-winged blackbird female. Again, don't just think brown and streaky, it means it's a sparrow. And brown-headed cowbirds, same thing. Brown bird, oh, must be a sparrow, but it's not. Same with the dick sisel. Males are totally obvious on the left, but hey, you get a drab bird on the right. You can see why you might make that mistake, but big cardinal-sized bird with a big different shape beak. Same with meadowlark, totally different shape, but brown, streaky on the ground. You can see why that mistake might be made. The best thing to do is to learn all these birds and to get rid of the imposters, get outside, practice, learn your song sparrow, develop that feel. That bird's too dark. That streaking's not right. That habitat's not right for this. You're going to find your own tricks that work for you, but learn those habitat associations and some of those behavioral characteristics. Learn the song sparrow and how you can separate it. Study the field guide. Look for those main bullet point plumage characteristics. Just don't rely solely on those. And real quick, I know we're out of time. I am the conservation director, so I do need to mention that a lot of these sparrows are in trouble. Many of them are grassland birds or coastal birds. Those are two of the most imperiled areas in our country. Grassland birds have lost over 50% of all grassland birds have declined in that time. Lots of habitat conversion into agriculture and development, things like that. Coastal birds are really in trouble. Salt marsh sparrow, some people are suggesting might go extinct in my lifetime. So a lot of these birds are really in trouble for various reasons. Habitat loss is the big one. Pesticides, birds will eat pesticide-coated seeds and it'll delay their migration. It can affect their weight gain, all sorts of things. Some of them collide with buildings. The bird in my hand on the upper right is a grasshopper sparrow that I found luckily alive in downtown Atlanta that had run into a building down there. So a lot of things are hitting these birds and they're amazing and need our help. And so I appreciate you sticking with me and listening to me talk for an hour and a half about little brown birds. Hopefully it was helpful. Hopefully reviewing the recording will give you some more information. And I can stop sharing. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them if you still want to stick around.